The key part here is because of the historical policies, the population is aging very fast. So China, by 2020, will have over 200 million people who are over the age of 60, and by 2030, it will be 380 million. So that is actually greater than the size of the U.S. in terms of elderly. So the disease burden associated with that is quite significant as well. So if you think about this, 4 to 5 million new cancer diagnosed patients every year, 130 million diabetics, 100 million hepatitis B carriers. So just structurally, as a large country, as an aging country, there are many, many issues. So the healthcare opportunities arises from and the healthcare burden arises from the large population itself. That's really the underlying fundamental factor. And I think the other one is then really the government willingness to really sort of care for the public in sort of increasing their healthcare spend. We started hearing about this actively, about 10 years ago in the 2009 healthcare reform. So I guess it's a dozen years ago now. And the government has really continued in terms of the infrastructure spending, in the reorganization, in the streamlining, so that essentially China today has near universal coverage in terms of a public health insurance. China will be spending, by 2030 or so, close to $1.6 trillion in healthcare amongst all different aspects. So that is a fairly significant spend. It's also the second largest in the world. So the government has actively chosen to streamline all the regulatory processes, at least around the products, for product registration and approval, desiring that to be as near to US and European timelines as possible. And then on the counterpart to that, a very active willingness to fund and reimburse for these innovative therapies. So there's been a lot of new announcements, and some of them already being implemented over the past year. Around the service space, there is also a desire to increase private investment in order to complement the public investment in ensuring there is sufficient healthcare infrastructure to support the public. Unfortunately, some of the regulatory aspects around whether it's sort of approving hospitals or approving investments or sort of ensuring faster insurance rollout, those are still lag a little bit behind. But in general, overall, the government has quite a wide range of policies around that. So you mentioned medical devices. That is perhaps out of all the product side, the one that's impacted the most. Essentially, every single import into China now in medical devices from the US has a tariff on it, anywhere between 5 and 25%. Now, so what does a company do here, right? If you're an American company, or if you're a Chinese company and you import a Chinese product, you have to decide what to do with that extra 25% of the cost. Now, on the back end, you are limited by your tender price. Who is going to absorb that? Are you going to absorb it, or is your distributor going to absorb it, or do you share that? Because in China, on the device side, there's very little opportunity to pass the cost on to the patients. On some of the other type of products on the drug side, that is still a little bit less impacted. The standard tariff is really around 3 or 6%, and for some of the products such as oncology, it's actually at 0. So it's not a uniform pass around that, but it is something, if this tariff escalation continues, clearly the companies need to have backup plans around that. We already see some of the suppliers rethinking their supply chain, but in the medical products, it's not that easy because the products registration are actually tied to where the plant is, where it's manufactured. So it's not something you can just change overnight, even if you have the capacity to do so. So any solution will require some time to implement.